Hi, everybody, and welcome in to our presentation today, Youth Voice During COVID from a Healing-Centered Perspective. I want to show you a little bit of our agenda before we start setting the space and telling our story. So we're going to talk about youth perspectives related to COVID and the educational employment landscape. We're going to talk about healing-centered approaches and how to build resiliency, talk about self-care and coping skills, and then we're going to have a little closing and Q&A at the end. So an introduction to us, my name is Jules Villanueva-Castaño, and I'm the Supported Education and Employment Specialist with Stanford Center for Youth Mental Health and Wellbeing. I work as a part of the Alcove Project, where we're launching centers in San Jose and Palo Alto, but also statewide as a model of helping young people. The model will be a center, and it'll support young people ages 12 to 25 with mild to moderate mental health symptoms. And in this service, they can get peer support services, which is, a young person with lived mental health experience, and they can talk to them peer-to-peer. There'll be clinical and psychological services, supported education employment services, physical health services like seeing a nurse or a doctor, and substance use services. But as a part of this alcove, there's a youth advisory group, and that's where Ethan and Chandler come in. So they're the youth voice of the center to really center us around what's effective and how young people want to be treated when they come into a center. And so we've been meeting for the last 2 months, about, twice a week for about an hour. And we've been having really amazing conversations about mental health and what young people are seeing related to mental health. So we wanted to come and share our story today with you. But first, I'd like to have Ethan introduce himself so you can get to know Ethan, and then we'll have Chandler introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Ethan. I'm a senior in high school. I've been working on this project with Jules and Chandler and Ellen for a few months. And I thought that this was an important presentation to share because I know that COVID has put a lot of things into high gear, and school and work in the future stresses out a lot of young people, myself included. So I hope that this presentation can give people the tools to help cope with that, and also to better understand how institutions can be centered around healing.
Yeah, so hi, I'm Chandler. I'm a high school junior, and, I know that I've been going through some of this stuff during lockdown, and I just think that, these kinds of things are really important to talk about, and I think that it's a good opportunity to get this stuff out there.
Thanks. Thank you, Ethan and Chandler. And we just want to thank Made of Millions and all of you for tuning in live, and those who'll be watching as a recording. We're so thankful for this space and for being able to, just share out what we learned during these conversations together, and really getting to know each other via Zoom over the last 2 months. So we wanted to ask a little icebreaker to kind of open the space, and you're welcome to answer this in the chat. We'll have a little space at the end for a Q&A, or if we hear a really funny or good one, my partner behind the scenes, Andrea, will let us know. But to Ethan and Chandler, you guys can, either one of you can answer as you would like. What is one thing you would change about the post-COVID world as a young person?
I think for me personally, I would prefer if there was more space to do work asynchronously or have a hybrid model for school. Chandler?
Yeah, I don't know. It might honestly just be that I would make my room bigger so that I had more space to spread out, because I feel kind of cramped all the time, which feels very selfish. But, I feel like that kind of claustrophobia is something that we're all going through on some level or another.
Yeah, super valid. Thank you. And I think lack of space is something we'll talk a little bit about later, but it's so true. We're all inside, we're very close together, and kind of adds to the tension, I think, for a lot of people. So thank you. And, if you have answers in the chat, we're really excited to hear. I like magic wand questions because it allows us to dream and think about what's possible, and, sometimes get some really cool insights. So moving us forward, we're definitely here to talk today about youth perspectives on the COVID educational employment landscape. And we want to start off just by setting the space, and it felt really important to us for us to start by talking about the fact that this pandemic is really collectively traumatic, especially for young people. Young people today are experiencing a generational shift, unlike we have seen in a very long time, and maybe generations or ever. In our conversations, some themes that came up were just kind of feeling like there's this overall sense of hopelessness. There's kind of a sense of we don't know what's next. And then Ethan and Chandler are really going to highlight this as we move through, so I don't want to steal any of their thunder, but we just kind of wanted to orient ourselves that there's a generational shift, and there's just a lot of trauma around what's been happening recently for young people related to the pandemic. Ethan.
Okay, yeah.
Oh, sorry, Chandler. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, it's
my fault.
It's all right. Yeah, I guess I was kind of just talking about this, but with the lockdown, obviously, we're not allowed to go outside. We don't go to school. We don't go to work anymore. Or, well, a lot of people are, just staying inside, staying at home. And so, in a lot of ways, there's no more, sort of variety. We live with the same 3 or 4 people at all times, and it just kind of feels like there's no space to open up, to breathe, I guess. And it doesn't hurt that for a lot of people their personal and professional spaces are one and the same now. I know that the chair where I do my reading is 3 feet away from the desk where I do my homework, and it's a stressful environment. And because you're spending all of your time with the same handful of people, fuses get shorter, and it's just kind of uncomfortable a lot of the time.
Yeah. Thank you, Chandler. And now we'll go to Ethan.
Okay. So as more and more people are starting to live online due to the pandemic, young people are starting to look towards social media to foster social interactions instead of physical reality. And this can create a worry of feeling unprepared for adult life because we're missing out on experiences that are really integral to developing our identity, jobs, internships, sports, or even social events like prom. Off to Chandler then.
Yeah, because everything's kind of up in the air with COVID. It doesn't always feel like there's a certain path, going forward, in the way that we're so specifically raised. You go to high school, and then maybe in your last year of high school, first year of college, you get a job, and you work your way up in the job as you're going through college, and here's how you apply for college and all this stuff. And because of the way that things are changing now, all of those systems are just kind of up in the air, and we don't necessarily know what exactly is happening with all of them. College applications have completely changed. What jobs entail has completely changed. It's not sure necessarily what's going to happen after high school, or even in the years of high school that we're going through right now. Yeah.
Thank you, Chandler. I think I feel really grateful for both of your voices to share what young people are feeling. And part of my experience, professionally speaking, is for the last 15 years, I've worked with young people in mental health teams, in spaces around mentoring and systems. And I spent the last year before I came to Stanford working with young people to try to support them educationally, remotely. And everything you're saying is what I heard, but you're saying it in a way that I think is in true, authentic youth voice. So just thank you so much for sharing. And I know it's not easy to share sometimes, what you've experienced. And I'm just so grateful for both of your voices. One thing that we talked about that really hit home for me, and I've been using everywhere, and I hope it's okay, is the idea of this COVID guilt trip. And I just think it's this kind of really interesting way of thinking about, and I think it was you, Chandler, who said it, where you feel like, you have all this extra time, and it's like this performative aspect of, why haven't you learned to martial art, or why aren't you learning to underbutter basket weave, or why aren't your grades through the roof, and I think adults might have some unrealistic expectations sometimes. And that's kind of what I heard in the conversation. And, even with my son, who's 16, and we've had a lot of realistic conversations of, this is really hard. A lot of things have been taken away. And so there's this kind of guilt trip of you should be doing better, but it's so much harder. And, Ethan, you wanted to say something around this.
Yeah, when we were talking about this, Ellen brought up a really good point about how the COVID guilt trip can kind of lead to imposter syndrome, because there's this idea that if you have more privilege, if you live in a wealthier area, or if you're less affected by COVID than other people, or also if you have symptoms like depression, anxiety symptoms that will fluctuate from day to day, that you're just making your problems up and you're not really struggling. And there's also this idea that a lot of people might not want to acknowledge that they do struggle, especially in times of crisis, because they see it as a sign of weakness.
Yeah. Thank you, Ethan. I thought that was a really important thing to share. And I think it is what some young people are feeling, and people in general. So moving us forward, we wanted to be a little cheeky and present some positive news. We had a lot of conversations that moved through some heavy themes, and, and kind of checking in about themes, I wanted to make sure, we tonally talked about something positive, or we looked at maybe kind of unintended consequences of the pandemic and remote learning. And so, Ethan, you had some things you wanted to share.
Right. Some students feel that school is a lot easier this year. Some students might feel safer or more comfortable doing school online, like if they feel marginalized at school, or they've had negative interactions with staff or administration, or even if like the journey to school is unsafe or super long. Personally, I prefer online school just because I'm more of a shy person. And also content-wise, school can be easier online, especially when it's a lot easier for people to like Google the answers during a test and stuff like that. But it's important to also acknowledge that this is a gray area. And while some students may be excelling more during this time, there's also a lot of students that are struggling. So I think this exemplifies the need for, a shift to a more diverse approach to education. Jules?
Yeah, thank you, Ethan. And, we're going to talk a lot more about some kind of different approaches about, what those different approaches are. The healing-centered approach is one of them. But in our conversations, I was always trying to bring articles and resources and different approaches. And so everything we're presenting to you has really been vetted by Ethan and Chandler and Ellen, our private partner, our content builder in the background. And so, when we talked about even presenting this next study, talking about Latinx youth mental health and there being a positive trend, this was a study that I brought to our team from the Journal of American Academy of Child Adolescent Psychiatry, in case you're curious of looking this up. I can send you the link later. But we found it really interesting as just kind of like a phenomena of young people, Chicana, Latino, Latina, Hispanic youth in the Southwest. There was actually a decrease in mental health issues for these young people. So less mentalizing around or anxiety around school-related or issues in their community. And we had this really great conversation of like, why might this be happening? And there were some amazing insights that came up. Maybe the young people don't feel safe at school. Maybe they don't feel safe in their community as they go to school. There's safety issues. And then I happen to know, from being Latino myself, that there's a very strong connection to family within the community. And so, and even reading the article, they say that, by being at home, there's more resiliency factors. So for some young people, the pandemic and being at home may actually be more of a positive situation in the sense that they feel safer. Obviously, they're missing their education. There's all these other consequences, but mental health wise, it may actually be a little safer for them or a little less of a difficult experience. So with that, we want to transition away from our positive news section and kind of dive back into the meat of, really asking ourselves in these conversations, who is being the most affected? This was something that Ethan, Chandler, and Ellen really felt was important to talk about. There was this acknowledgement, I think, within the group, and myself included, that we're all pretty lucky. We all have a lot of resources. And so we really wanted to make sure to highlight, those who are being most affected by the situation. Chandler, you wanted to share a little more?
Yeah, whenever situations like this happen, it is important to talk about the fact that, not everyone is going to be affected in the same way. Not everyone is going to feel the effects to the same degree. And so, it is important to talk about the fact that in many ways, marginalized youth are going to be more affected by events like this. So that just means, people of color, members of the LGBT community, families with low incomes, and people who were before, socially isolated or shy already. To use a quote that Jules wrote while we were working on the project, if you're already on the margins, you might feel more put to the side. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to hand it off to Jules for the next slide.
Thank you, Chandler. and appreciate you quoting me. That very rarely happens, so thank you. No, and I think it was such a good conversation that we had about who's being most affected, and it made me really think about even the work I'm going to be doing in Santa Clara County, and how we can talk about themes. And so one article I brought to Ethan, Chandler, and Ellen for discussion was from the Society for Research and Child Development. And it basically highlights for African American youth, particularly in the states of Texas, New York, California, and Washington, that basically there is a lot of issues with remote learning. Even a study that I read recently from the LAUSD, the Los Angeles Union School District, said that African American youth in that district are engaging at about less than half of their white counterparts. So we made sure to talk about this and really kind of explore even our thoughts about this, even within our own community. And so, Ethan, you wanted to share a little bit about that, and then I can kind of follow up on what we're seeing here in Santa Clara County around these issues.
Right. So in Santa Clara County, there's a lot of inequity. So for youth in South County, there's a tech divide that makes it more difficult to access technology that allows people to learn online at school. And there's also the fact that young people will be more affected by maybe themselves having to work or their family having to work in high-risk areas. And I think George mentioned this already, but he has had experience working with South County youth.
Yeah, so thank you, Ethan. And I think that's what I just want to share is my previous experience is working as an education liaison with youth in the system. And some of my youth were working in and living in South County, Santa Clara County. And what we're seeing anecdotally and even when research-wise is that there are a lot of tech gaps, which means that young people might have a device, but they're not able to use it in a way that's helpful for them in learning. They might have a bandwidth or a token to access, Wi-Fi, but it doesn't work at the bandwidth they need to actually get access. And so this has a direct effect on the mental health of young people because if they can't be successful in school, there's going to be compounding consequences. They're going to get further behind, and kind of all those things we were talking about earlier of every young person is feeling the stress of the pandemic. But if you can't connect to school, you can't keep yourself moving forward, that stress really starts to compound and it starts to feel bigger and heavier. So, why is this happening? Well, it's evident to everybody. It's a lack of resources, historically speaking, that's exacerbating disparities in these communities. It's obviously not just communities of color. There's, under-resourced communities throughout populations. But in our conversations, we just really wanted to highlight that these situations occur most often historically where there just is a lack of resources. And it really felt important to Ethan, Chandler, and Ellen to share this. I definitely asked them, what content for resonates, what do you think young people need to hear and understand? And they really felt strongly that this was just really, really important to talk about. So, we're digging into lack of resources. And so, we wanted to also just ask ourselves, what is happening? Why are things happening this way? And why are young people disconnecting? And why does it feel this way? And so, Chandler had some really great thoughts that he wanted to share just around social engagement.
Yeah, while you're at school, you sort of are forced to interact with other people during the day, even if it's in ways that you don't necessarily notice, just saying hi to people in the hallways, interacting with your teacher in a classroom setting, just being around other people in general. And that is no longer a thing that is happening. And, I know at least for me, I'm not a particularly outgoing person. You've probably noticed me stumble a couple of times during the presentation. And I know that it's been hard for me, particularly during lockdown, to actually, reach out to other people and, keep hold of those connections that I have from school and just, to help myself feel less isolated. There's no community by association, right? Yeah, so with that, I'm going to hand it off to Ethan.
Okay. So the typical work that is associated with being a teenager or a young person is asserting your independence and your identity. And with COVID, a lot of activities that help young people find themselves are being canceled, like sports or clubs or theater and arts. So this translates to a loss of ability to find people's passions and make friends. And it's also the small moments too. It's not just big identity moments. It's also just like daily interactions with people, and that's like a real sense of loss, the limits of living online.
Thank you so much. Leading us into our next point, it's just that loss, I think, of this, what I call, and what teachers know as the generative social field, this idea that you're in a classroom learning, you're around your peers, there's a teacher in front of you. And we talked a lot about, Ellen, and you both just feeling like not having that teacher there or your peers next to you, being able to walk out in the hallway and talk to somebody. Even talking to my son who's 16, is this loss of being able to just engage with people and just share space, I think, is such a loss for young people. It's hurtful for adults, but I think for young people, it creates a feeling of like, how do I, like you were saying earlier, how do I have all these developmental relationships? And so, where is the time being spent? I found this graphic inside of a study from Child Mind Institute, and I think it's kind of like a no duh moment, but I mean, we know that a lot of time is being spent online, on Instagram, Snapchat, texting, doing other classwork to just get done with your day. I remember checking in plenty of times as a group, and there was this kind of feeling like the days just never seem to end. It's like, I remember you all saying, I'd log into my class, I do my work, I go onto Instagram, I do some more work, I take a nap, and before I know it, it's nighttime, and so, it's this interesting position I think adults are asking young people to be in, is, to do everything online and then sort of chastising them for doing everything online, including socializing. So where's the time being spent? Very clearly on these apps. And, I think that that's something just to be aware of, and maybe not even a judgmental sense, but just in kind of holding that for young people, that, this is a reality we've asked them to be a part of as an adult. So we want to shift into talking about what is being healing centered. Some of you here might know what being healing centered or a healing centered approach is. For some of you, this might be relatively new. So kind of grounding ourselves in why we're talking about this, and in our conversations, there was really a sense of like, how do we give tools? How do we talk about approaches that could be helpful for adults who work with young people or who know young people in their lives, or even young people supporting young people? What are some like kind of best practices or ways to have really good conversations when things are hard? And so healing-centered approaches is something that I feel very aligned to. I really do think that helps open spaces and helps young people feel more comfortable in sharing. And so one of the tenets of a healing-centered approach is, we ask what's right with you versus what's wrong with you. We take a step back from blame or judgment or our personal biases as adults or as an individual, and we look at the collective strengths of the individual. We're mindful that trauma and people's backgrounds and identities can really play into how people act in stressful situations. And so when I brought this, approach to this group, it was very much a conversation, and wanting to really understand what it is. So really a central part of a healing-centered approach is to understand trauma and how it really relates for young people and for all of us. When I first brought this graphic into our group, it created some confusion and also some amazing conversation. And it really challenged me as an adult, and as, a leader or mentor in this conversation around mental health, to really explain this in a way that makes sense. And so what we know is that individual trauma is those things that happen to us, inside of, maybe something happens to us, like we get in a car accident, or an individual event happens to us that are, not normal, but the things that happen to us in life. We get sick, we fall down a flight of stairs, we get hurt. It's a really traumatic experience, but that's one thing that happens, and, they normally happen. That's life, right? There's interpersonal traumas. These are things like domestic violence inside of relationships that continually happen. Really difficult things like perpetuated homophobia or racism, bullying. Again, really hard, difficult things, but things that typically can happen in life. We're aware that there's these traumatic events. Collective trauma, as I kind of talked about earlier, is things like a pandemic, a war, really large group things that happen to an overall population, a group of people. And so for the sake of what we're talking about, this collective trauma is the pandemic for young people. And so the reason we wanted to show this, and it really resonated with Ellen, Ethan, and Chandler to talk about this, because I asked their permission to talk about everything we're talking about here today, is basically that if you see a young person struggling, if those individual or interpersonal traumas, those normal traumas, or those things that happen normally in lives are causing like really big explosions, or, I just can't go to school, it might be because these traumas are compounding. That collective trauma, the pandemic, is intermixing with those interpersonal individual traumas. And that's when I know from my experience in working with young people that things can just kind of go off the rails and get difficult. So we share this as a way of just kind of expressing understanding, and maybe for adults or young people who are seeing friends act in ways that are different, after the pandemic, just really being mindful of trauma and how it affects people. So this graphic, again, I asked permission to Ellen, Ethan, and Chandler to show all of this. And really the purpose is we wanted to really just get people to see that healing-centered approaches are kind of coming from somewhere. So from the far right on the healing organizations here, there's, historically speaking, systems, mental health systems, schools, law enforcement, 20, 30 years ago, most were very trauma reactive, very much saying, what's wrong with you? Or a very kind of blamey sort of, I can't believe you did this approach. And there are, we talked about this in the context of like, some teachers are more healing centered, or some schools are more healing centered, or less healing centered and more trauma reactive. So it's a way of developing a language and a narrative and kind of an idea of what systems can be. If you're getting into the trauma-informed approach, that's most schools, most mental health systems, most clinicians, most people are pretty aware trauma exists, sociocultural trauma, identity, these things really do affect people. A healing-centered approach goes beyond that, and it recognizes those things. It absolutely does, and it encapsulates those, but it also really makes sure we're asking questions like, are we asking first before we move into helping people? Are we really making sure what we do is youth-centered and youth-focused? Are we really checking in that the solution that we have adults or the person who's making the solutions came up with is what the youth wants? So, we talked a lot about healing-centered approaches, but really what we're hoping to do is just kind of inform you, on that this is out there, and that if you want to do any extra research or if you want to connect with me to learn more, I'm definitely available to do so. Ethan, you want to share a little bit about this funny meme we found and we talked about in our conversation?
Yeah, Jules found the meme and put it up. It's sort of just like talking about how schools can, sort of prioritize memorization over actual learning. And I know that I've definitely felt this way. I'm sure it's relatable for a lot of people. And I think especially during the pandemic, it's a lot harder to actually feel like you're learning, because a lot of the emphasis is more on just like memorizing information and then like regurgitating it during tests. And I think there are a lot of loopholes that have been found with online school. I don't want to expose myself, but I think that there's been a lot more cheating lately. So I think something good that can come out of this, though, is that there's more of a shift in how we view education as young people, as parents, and as educators as well. Yeah.
Thanks, Ethan. And, I appreciate you being vulnerable, and, no one's exposing themselves, but I just appreciate it in our conversations where we got into conversations kind of personally about how we're experiencing things. And, and working with young people and talking to young people, I think it's kind of realizing that situations like this do throw young people into gray areas. And then we kind of step back as adults and ask them to navigate that. So just thank you for being vulnerable and expressing that. And I think a lot of young people are having that feeling of being worried. I know my daughter, who's 13, told me the other day that she was worried about going back to school because she's like, I can't look at the answers on Google. And it was so sweet. She was just honest, and I really appreciated that. And I just felt like really warm that she could just be really open and tell me that, because that's her genuine fear. So I just want to say thank you for sharing that, Ethan. I know that's not always easy, and that vulnerability might help other people kind of recognize that as something that's going on for them as well. Kind of just going back to the principles of a healing-centered approach, and again, vetting this through the youth advisory group members, and just really wanting to make sure this resonated, is I really want people to understand that, and we wanted folks to understand that healing-centered approaches happen through relationships. A relationship is the center of the approach, and so that's where it's, I don't want to say it's non-clinical, but it definitely rides the line of being more of a peer or a collaborative relationship is certainly what I would call it. And inside of that relationship, we're definitely prioritizing safety and trust. We as adults, or the person who's helping somebody, we want to make sure we're always checking first. We want to make sure we're safe and the other person is safe, but also that we're building trust in a healthy way. This means that we're honoring choice, we're honoring the youth voice, and we're being collaborative. We're understanding that some young people might not want help. They might have had traumatic experiences in the past where someone coming to help them didn't go well, maybe based on their cultural background or historical background of their family, maybe where they came from previously in their immigration journey, their identity or gender, is around, maybe they're going through a journey themselves around who they are. It's just really important to center that as an adult or as somebody, looking at a healing centered approach. If we're talking about empowerment, I like to say this because empowerment almost sounds like you're giving power to somebody and you're holding it. I like to think about it as being an ally and walking alongside young people. And so when I brought this to Ethan, Ellen, and Chandler, and we were talking about it, and I was asking if it resonated, they definitely said it did, because they feel like that they see adults in their lives behave this way and do this, and then they see adults who don't. And so, we're hoping that as we share this out, maybe we do presentations in other places, we can share this way of doing things that's just a little different. And maybe it's just a tool in the tool belt for adults to approach difficult conversations a little differently. So one tool that I've developed over the years is through my working in community and just kind of trying to develop little tools for myself to maintain compassionate, is the idea of wearing compassion goggles. And Ethan, you wanted to tell us a little bit about that.
Right. So the first step to using compassion goggles is to look at difficult behaviors and ask why. So when we were talking about this before, Jules used the example of like a little kid running around during class and disrupting other students. So the way that we can look at difficult behaviors in that scenario and ask why is to, as the educator or adult or the person in power in that situation, rather than punish the child immediately, the goal is to take a step back and really understand why the kid is acting that way instead of punishing them. So it's sort of like a self-check. And the important thing is also to be kind to yourself if you're not ready to do that, and just remember that the goal is empathy.
Thanks, Ethan. And, since we have a little time, I just, want to share a story about a young person I work with who kind of taught me this lesson. And, part of a previous role that I had, and, Ethan and Chandler, I think you asked me to kind of share a story to make sure kind of people understand why I think this is really important. And I can remember a young man I was working with in a school who was about 8 years old. And one of my roles was to come into schools and support young people who were in crisis, on an on-call basis. And this young person was just not able to sit still. They were jumping around the room, sort of like they were propelled by a jet engine. And they clearly had brought everybody to their wits' end. The teacher in the classroom was overwhelmed. The vice principal sitting in the doorway, not happy. And, from my previous experience in working in, behavior analysis and really trying to understand trauma and how it's affecting young people, I just felt like there was just really a lot of difficult things happening for this young person. And as I got to know the family, over time, over months, I was, slowly got to build relationships with the family and the grandparents and the mom and the dad and everybody. And it was really clear this young person had so much going on at home that their behaviors were really an effect of trauma. And what they were really doing is coping with a really difficult situation. And the more we were able to draw that story out to all the people in their lives, the teacher, the principal, the yard duty, the person who serves lunch, as people kind of saw that this youth was coming from a really difficult background, you could see the compassion grow. And so that's where my idea around compassion goggles came from, as a service provider in the community, and sometimes as an adult who are dealing with a lot of situations, we sort of forget what it's like to be young. And if we haven't experienced trauma in our own lives, or if we haven't seen it up front and close, it might be hard for us to identify. So, for me, that story really sticks out because as soon as we brought people together and everybody was speaking the same language about this young person's trauma, not that things became perfect, but I could see that young person be more in alignment with their environment. They could ask for help. They could say, I'm feeling really upset. And the adults around them could shift to actually being able to support them. So, when we talked about healing-centered approaches, I think for Ellen especially, she was kind of like, well, this feels a little, woo-woo and a little bit not real. And I totally get that because this is a shift away from traditional clinical therapeutic. Not that it's away from it, it goes to a different space. And so we wanted to give some tips around what is being healing-centered and aware in interactions. And the biggest tip I can give is be authentic and real. If I find myself as a 40-year-old human saying things like, did you get lit last week? Or, that was super dope. I try to be really careful because it's not authentic to me, and young people have amazing, what I call BS detectors. It sort of makes people back off. And I think everybody has a BS detector, But I think for teenagers, it just kind of puts that even more on edge. And there's even an edge of, I think, when you're being unauthentic, is that you're being sort of disrespectful. And maybe even young people would feel like you're being judgmental or not supportive, by not actually trying to ask them in a really authentic way, like, what's going on with you, in your own words. We want to take a witness versus a solving stance. I think, as adults or anybody trying to help somebody, we can feel something called empathic distress, or this feeling of like we have to help because we're in pain watching someone suffer. And so we have to own sometimes that we're in that space, and we have to slow down and ask ourselves, what would really be helpful? Should I ask first before helping? And often the answer is yes. I think people get themselves in trouble, especially around cultural identity issues. If you forget the context, if you step in to try helping too quickly, you might lose trust. And that young person might step away from trusting you, or they might feel like you're every other adult in their lives. So yeah, and Chandler, you wanted to add a few things on to some tips here.
Just like whenever you're approaching a situation that's clearly fraught, listen first. Just hear what they have to say, hear the whole story before jumping in and asserting, this is what we're going to do. This is the solution. Like, I think it feels kind of common sense to say it out loud, but in a lot of situations, I don't think that it is practice. So just, put a spotlight on it, keep it in mind. And then the last one, just like move slowly to build trust. Don't rush things. Even once you've heard the whole story, you might not necessarily still be in a position to help someone immediately, or, they might not want you to. You don't want to push somebody out of their comfort zone, especially when you're trying to help them. And so you just want to don't rush things, don't force it. And with that, handing it back to Jules.
Thank you, Chandler. What you just said really resonates with me with working with young people. And, I've learned over the years that if I'm too pushy or I try to push my agenda, often it's like herding cats. It ends up just being very circular. And so that's just amazing advice. And I really just appreciate that, both of you were willing to have these conversations about healing-centered approaches, and, that we're sharing it out and even talking about it. So, thank you. So we're going to move into talking about self-care and coping skills. And we want to have a really realistic conversation. We don't think this is a panacea or a magic wand solution, but we want to introduce it and have a good conversation. And so, Ethan, you wanted to share a little bit about self-care ideas.
Right. So we're starting off with this graphic that I think shows the kind of self-care tips that a lot of young people will be more familiar with. And I know that they look simple, they seem easy, but it's important to acknowledge just how hard self-care can be for a lot of people. And to acknowledge that if it's difficult to take care of yourself in these ways, you can make self-care easier for yourself by doing things like organizing your space or just taking a break from work. Jules will follow up with more concrete tools.
Thanks, Ethan. Pardon me. We wanted to also just kind of hit some themes around self-care. Like the last slide is definitely some activities and things you can do. Going too far. But some self-care ideas, just things that we like to keep in our head. And when we're thinking about self-care is just really one, paying attention to your self-talk, that voice in your head, that might be telling you those negative things. I think we all have that voice, some of us stronger than others. Just pay attention to it. We don't want to chastise ourselves or admonish ourselves, because then again, that's more negative self-talk. But if you find a lot of negative just flowing through, just identify it and then celebrate your strengths. I think that's a great way to meet that negative self-talk if it is negative. Calling a friend, calling a family member, a trusted adult, a mentor who sees the positive in you, who looks at those strengths in you and can reverberate those back to you and say, well, you're such a great listener and you care so much. And, that's why you have these feelings sometimes. Those people in our lives are so valuable. Don't forget those people, those friends, those teachers, and then being able to accept your flaws. We're all flawed. And I think, being in a pandemic, we have a lot of time to sit here and, as my dad would say, stare at your navel, just have a lot of time to sit and reflect, and we have to accept that we all have flaws and we have to be able to let them go. Practicing the self-care, again, kind of a part of, those flawed aspects of our lives. I think sometimes there's this performative aspect of self-care, and we talked somewhat about that, I think, quite a bit. And is this almost this feeling of like you go on Instagram to post a selfie to show that you're doing self-care, but it doesn't have to be that way. Self-care can be very private. It can be very unintentional. It can be whatever you want it to be. So, it doesn't have to feel like you're getting a grade, or if you don't do it, you're a failure. I know a lot of young people who don't want to call it self-care. That doesn't resonate with them. It feels outside of their culture. They might call it just time to themselves, or meditation time, or prayer time, or whatever works for you to ground you. And then helping others is just a really wonderful way to connect yourself to community. I don't think there has to be a scale. The scale could be that you could volunteer your time, you could join a youth advisory group, kind of on the high end, or you could, go help your neighbor who's a little elderly move their trash cans at night, or do a chore for your parents, or build some connection. But just that as a tool can really be, these basic themes have helped me a lot get through the pandemic. So we hope sharing it, would help young people. It's just kind of some ideas. So moving into what we're calling mental health first aid, this is the part of the training which we're talking some about coping skills, and we want to really acknowledge that we're doing this virtually. We're doing this in a pandemic, so these are just tools in a tool belt. But it resonated with Ethan, Chandler, and Ellen to do some tools, so folks could walk out of here with some tools in their tool belt around mental health first aid. And so the one thing we really want to acknowledge is that trauma can trigger overwhelming feelings. And I think that might feel redundant to some people, but it is why we really grounded ourselves in trauma in this training, really tried to have an understanding of how trauma can affect young people and everybody. But just recognizing, if you're in some, state of feeling trauma, that will trigger overwhelming feelings for you. Ethan, you wanted to talk about recognizing triggers a little bit.
Right. Recognizing the trigger can be hard for a lot of young people, and it can also be hard for adults to understand what kind of things youth struggle with. For example, worrying about school or grades, worrying about an uncertain future, with climate change and political instability, and also trauma that's compounded by the pandemic, like how we talked about earlier. Youth of color are a lot more impacted by the pandemic.
Thank you, Ethan. As we introduce these tools, I definitely want to highlight to people, this is just one set of tools, again, in your tool belt. If this doesn't resonate for you, this doesn't feel authentic to you, I definitely have my email available. I would love to kind of talk about coping skills or introduce other ones. The ones we're showing today are from a CBT model. So this is basically a clinical model related to trauma. And so we're going to be talking about using what's called crisis coping skills. So when would you use these? So you would use these when you're feeling intense emotional pain, or you feel like acting on emotions that might be inappropriate or unsafe. Like, for example, if you're at work and your boss says something to you and you just feel like walking away, but you'll lose your job and that'll have disastrous consequences. Or, Chandler, did you want to share a little bit about this as well?
Yeah, just in a situation where you feel overwhelmed, but you have to act like you got it all under control. Like a classroom setting, or like your boss, or like a conversation with your parents.
Yeah.
Or, if you're just in a stressful environment where you don't necessarily feel like you can easily calm down, for whatever reason that might be.
Definitely. These are conversations I've had with young people in a lot of different spaces, maybe over thousands of times. And I definitely resonated, or definitely wanted to bring this back and forth with Ethan and Chandler and Ellen of, how do we present this and how do we do this in a way that's really careful? Because we certainly aren't saying that you should be using these skills if like every day, or if you're having a really emotional crisis or a feeling that things are just so overwhelming. That is the time when you definitely want to reach out to a trusted adult, reach out to a friend. At the end of this conversation, I'm going to be putting some links to finding resources in your area, some national locators through SAMHSA and NAMI. So again, if you're using these crisis coping skills, once a month, twice a month, that's pretty normal. We all have moments that things come up like that. But if you find yourself using it more than that, or you just feel really uncomfortable, there is help out there. Reach out to somebody. We just wanted to be really clear on saying that around using crisis coping skills. These are good for just kind of getting you, like Chandler said, through those difficult moments, getting you through that difficult conversation with your parents, those sort of situations. So kind of knowing when to use these tools. One is checking your temperature. I'm kind of cheesy. I call it a thermostat. And so the idea is to kind of see, where do you feel hot or cold in your body? I know that for me, when I get upset or the cortisol hits and I start to get stressed, I sort of lose myself in the moment. And so bringing myself into whether I feel hot or cold just kind of helps ground me in, how am I feeling? And should I be should I be doing something to calm myself down? Ethan, you wanted to talk a little bit about body signs.
Right. So knowing your body signs when you feel anxious or stressed, do you feel dizzy or get blurry vision? I know personally when I get anxious, I get really cold and my hands are like really shaky. So Jules can finish up.
Yeah. We had a funny moment in preparing for this, because I had my triggers on there and I get an itchy nose and I get really hot. And he's like, those aren't my triggers. That's not going to work. I just thought it was really fun when we were talking about body signs. That we all have really different body signs. And like Ethan said, just knowing your triggers, certain language, certain terms, certain microaggressions, maybe even a certain person can be your trigger. And just knowing those before you walk into a situation can kind of help you mentally prepare yourself for using your coping skills. So the first part of the skill is called the stop skill. Again, this is a CBT skill. You can look this up on the internet. It's very easy to go down the rabbit hole and learning about these skills. But the first piece is just stopping. And this skill maybe takes you 2 to 3 seconds. And the first thing you do is stop. You don't react and you just freeze. So the thing is said to you that triggers you, you feel the flood of emotion, you check your thermostat, and you know you need to stop yourself before you might do something you regret. So in that half a second, you stop yourself, you take a step back, and you take a breath, and you just try to let go that feeling that's going to make you do the thing you might regret later. And then inside of that moment, you're stopping, you're taking that breath, and then you're just observing. You're bringing yourself back into the moment, and you're noticing what's going on inside and outside of you. Because like I said, when that cortisol hits and you're in the moment, I've worked with young people for years. I can see when people go outside of themselves and they need to kind of notice, oh, I'm inside a house, I'm at a park, and it kind of grounds you. And so within that, 1 to 2 to 3 seconds, you then start proceeding mindfully. So really, you've stopped yourself, you've taken that step back, you're observing where you are, and now you're at the place where hopefully you can choose to use your coping skills, whatever that is. We're definitely going to show you a focused coping skill in just a second. But Ethan, you wanted to add something to this. You had a great point when we were preparing around this.
Yeah, Ellen actually brought up when we were preparing.
Sure.
This skill won't work for everyone, especially in more serious situations, like if you're having a panic attack, it might not help. And she also brought up that people might not realize that their coping skills that they're using can be harmful.
Yeah. Really important point, and I really appreciate you bringing that out and Ellen bringing it up initially. There are unhealthy coping skills, drug use, even food, working out too much. Obviously, coping skills aren't always positive. We're showing you a certain version of a coping skill from a CBT model, but this might not resonate with you. And like Ethan said, if you're having a larger mental health issue or things are just so overwhelming, like I said earlier, you're going to want to reach out for more support. With that being said, I want to show you the tip skill. And I like this because it's quick, it's simple, and it's kind of discreet, so you don't have to do it with a lot of fanfare. So the first thing you can do is tip the temperature of your face with cold water. And so the idea is, it's really simple. How many times have we heard someone say, throw cold water on your face? It actually works. You want the water to be about 50 degrees. And the reason it works is it triggers something called the mammalian dive response. And so that's just a fancy way of saying they've done studies on animals and humans. And when you put cold water on your face, it actually affects the nerve endings on your face and lowers the cortisol in your brain, which is the stress hormone that causes, what's the stress hormone? So you tip that temperature of your face. You could do that in your home. You could walk to your bathroom. You could be at school and excuse yourself. You could go off camera and just put water on your face. These are things you can do pretty discreetly. Intense exercise. Obviously we can't always go outside and go to the gym, or these days we can't go to the gym or go for a run. But even if, you were walking to the bathroom and you did 4 or 5 jumping jacks and a couple push-ups, that could count enough to get your blood flowing. And what you're releasing is dopamine into your body. So when you release that dopamine, you're, lowering that cortisol. Those two skills start to compound, and hopefully you're feeling that calming effect. Then if we can add in the layer, maybe after you've walked to the bathroom, you've done your little bit of exercise, you sit down, you can do some paced breathing. And so the formula I like to use to keep it really simple is 5 seconds in through your nose and 7 seconds out through your mouth. And if you do that for 1 to 2 minutes, you will actually, again, lower the cortisol in your body. You get oxygen flowing, and you can really start to feel yourself calming down. But if you do these in sequence or even out of sequence, they all work together to really slow you down. These are things professional athletes do, people who do large presentations. I found myself doing this before our presentation today. And then the final skill I want to share with you before we do a little Q&A is just paired muscle relaxation. And so, again, you could be in your seat, you could be in the back seat while arguing with your mom, you could be at work. The idea is to clench your body, maybe just your hands at first on both sides. And you could do that in your pockets, like 3 or 4 seconds. And you could do that while breathing. And then you just let it go. And then you could either go up or down your body. So you could then clench your wrists and then let it go. You could clench your shoulders and then let it go. But the idea is that we're releasing that physical energy, we're breathing, and we're bringing that awareness into our body. And so if we've used all these skills or some of these skills for a few minutes, hopefully we've calmed down enough to feel like we can have the conversation or move through the difficult moment. And again, just saying, if we're using these skills, we still feel really unwell, like Ethan said, and like we're saying, please reach out for support, reach out to a trusted person. These are just tools for your tool belt, and hopefully the beginning of a journey of learning more about coping skills. So with that, we have about 10 minutes left, and we want to do a little Q&A. So I'm going to go ahead and bring us out of the presentation and just see what kind of questions we might have. All right. So I see people saying it's important to acknowledge how hard self-care can be for people. Yeah. All right. Well, we've definitely appreciated being here today. We're really grateful for the space and being able to share with you all. And we're grateful to Made of Millions. And I'm just so grateful to Ethan and Chandler for being here with us today. Have you guys seen any questions that you feel like we should answer, or because I just dropped into the comment box?
I think Andrea said that there have not been any questions so far. There's just been people interacting in the chat. But...
Oh, cool. Awesome. All right. Well, yeah, maybe we'll hang out for a few seconds and just see if there are some questions. I see that we're getting a lot of comments. But yeah. Maybe we'll just give it a minute, and then if people don't have questions, we might just wrap up a little early. I'm going to go ahead and throw those resources into the chat now, and then I will follow up with those resources, putting them into the link later, so that if you don't get them now, they can definitely be shared later.
Someone's asking, will it be posted?
Yes, it will. It'll be on YouTube. And it will be, actually, I can send the link out now. So let me post these resources, and then I will send the link for the presentation later. So here's some resources. I just put that in the private chat, didn't I? That's fun. Here we go. Here are the resources. Okay. And then I'm going to put my email in there as well, and the link. No, I believe if you're watching it on YouTube, it will be the watch link that you're already on. So if I'm posting this and you're like, this looks like the same link as I'm watching on, that's probably it. Okay. And then I'm just going to post my email and have us hang around here for a few more minutes to see if there's any questions. Again, just want to thank Made of Millions and you know, Ethan and Chandler, and obviously Ellen, who couldn't be here with us, but just thank you so much. You guys rocked it. I'm so proud of you, and just thank you for all of your hard work. I really couldn't have done this without you, truly. You both are amazing, so thank you.
Thanks, Jules.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Welcome. Okay. I want to ask, what has brought you joy this week? Aw, that's a cute question. Do you guys want to answer, or do you want me to jump in and you guys can think of something? Well, I'll answer. Honestly, what's brought me joy this week is this presentation. I think it's kind of it is a lifetime goal of mine to amplify youth voice around mental health. I've spent a lot of time talking to young people about mental health. And so as cheesy as it sounds, doing this presentation and really developing a voice has been really great for me. So, yeah.
See, I don't have a better answer than that.
Oh.
Food
or a certain event or a TV show or...
You know, I don't know. I've been reading some books this week when I've had time after school and haven't had that much homework. So that's what's brought me joy, not having homework sometimes.
Nice. No homework is joy.
Yeah, I think, during this presentation, it definitely made me happy. I guess something else is I got my first college acceptances this week, and that's definitely made me happier.
That's so huge.
Thanks.
Congratulations. How exciting. Wow.
I think that's it.
Cool. Well, maybe we'll just hang out here just for a second to see if anybody else has any cool questions, like what's our joy? I like that question. Alrighty. Well, I think maybe the questions are slowing down a little bit. I don't want to keep us here forever. All right, well, let's just say goodbye. I think we're good, and people can always contact me via email. I'll throw my email in the chat one more time if there are any questions. And just, again, want to say thank you so much to Made of Millions, but just most importantly to you both, Ethan and Chandler. Thank you just so much. Bye.
We leave, right?